We are live. We can start.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Okay, well, hello everybody. This is Shota Guineria speaking here. I'll be moderating today's session. I am the Senior Fellow at the Economic Policy Research Center, and I'm very happy to present to the audience the most distinguished panel that we have managed to gather today. Ambassador Yin Kelly, who was ambassador to Georgia, and before he was ambassador to the OSCE, ambassador of the United States, of course, and now he is ambassador in residence for the program in international and area studies at Northwestern University. Next is David Cramer. I do not really think that he needs any introduction to the Georgian audiences or to the Georgia watchers, but I will still say that he is a senior fellow at Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, and he had a distinguished long-standing career in State Department, and he was the director of the Freedom House, among other important episodes of his career. And then last but not least, Nino Evgenidze, who is the director of Economic Policy Research Center. And we're here to discuss a report which was written by two of our panelists, Ambassador Kelly and David Cramer. The topic and the title of the report is telling in itself, a country on the verge, the case for supporting Georgia, which means that we are here among the friends of Georgia who are concerned about several aspects related to the developments in and around Georgia, and we will try to unpack all those difficult circumstances step by step as we go forward with our panel today. But before that, let me thank German Marshall Fund for supporting this publication. And there were a lot of good friends from GMF involved in the publication. And there was a nice presentation done also under the GMF auspices, which also presented a very good basis for today's discussion. And of course, thanks to EPRC, who facilitated today's discussion, and the print of the book, actually, which will be also translated in Georgian, and it will be issued sometime next week. So stay tuned into the EPRC's webpage, and you will have a chance to see the Georgian translation of this report as well. So how we're going to proceed with this discussion today is that we will skip the opening statements, and we will try to be as interactive as possible, because due to this new realities that we live in, we're all chained to our screens and computers, and it's worth trying to engage in the dialogue and interactive conversation rather than listening to another webinar, even with such a distinguished panel. So I will start asking questions to the panelists right away. I'll be also monitoring the chat box here during the whole session. So if there are any questions, I will try to incorporate them into the discussion as we go forward with the panel. And then, of course, at the end of the panel, there will be a chance for a Q&A session as well. So without any further delay, let me open this session today by asking a question related to more wider and broader regional developments before we zoom into Georgia-specific issues. Because what we see around Georgia today is not a surprise because this part of the world has always been challenging, and a lot of security threats and challenges has been there for decades. But at this particular moment in time, we see that in the Black Sea theater, there are alarming developments in Ukraine, and Russia's increasing militarization along Ukraine's borders is one of those imminent threats and challenges that we see. In the South Caucasus theater, there was this Nagorno-Karabakh war, which brought us to completely new reality, I would say, without any exaggeration there, where Russia has actually managed to increase its influence even farther. And now Russia has a military presence in all three South Caucasus countries, and it is in full control of effective realities there through occupation of Georgia's territories, military base in Gyumri, and now stationing of the so-called peacekeepers in Azerbaijan. And the pressure on Georgia is increasing from all fronts, from all sides, and Georgia is there as a regional player whose strategic partners are situated outside the region, because other two South Caucasus countries have their strategic partnership with Russia and with Turkey, and they're part of this regionalized processes, if I may say so. But Georgia is there, you know, as a only real pro-Western nation with hopes and ambitions to be part of the Western world. But then here comes the question, you know, what are the compelling Western interests in the region at this point, and how West is going to fight for its share of influence in the region until it's too late, because Russia is managing to go forward with increasing its influences at the expense of that of the West's. So I would start by asking this question to David Cramer. David, please, could you help us to kind of unfold this? How does it look from Washington? I mean, what are the real compelling U.S. interests here in this region, and what are the tools that the United States has at hand to pursue those interests in the region and in Georgia?
Well, Shota, thanks very much. It's great to see you again, even if virtually. And I think Ian will join me in expressing huge thanks and appreciation to Nino and EPRC, not only for the publication of this Georgian version of the report and the translation that will come, but also for the production of the English version that GMF produced a few weeks ago. And we're grateful to GMF for its support as well on this, and the Black Sea Trust for all of its backing on that. And we're thrilled to be back in Georgia again, albeit virtually. And we hope before too long that we can be back there in person. And we wish everyone in Georgia the best in dealing with the pandemic. The interests the United States has in Georgia are along the lines of what you articulated, and that is, it is the most pro-Western and pro-American country in the region by far. And the perception in the United States is that Georgia, for the most part, has been a kind of island of democracy in a sea of authoritarianism. And we are now a little worried that that island may be sinking a little bit, and we don't want to see that. But our report makes the case that supporting Georgia is in U.S. interest. Georgia is at a crossroads for energy and transport and trade that runs through the South Caucasus and through the region. Georgia, I would argue, should be viewed not just as a country in the South Caucasus, but as a key member in the Black Sea region. The United States has strong interests in the Black Sea and seeing the region stable, and it has been destabilized to a significant extent by Russia, as you've mentioned, Shota. We also need to recognize the contributions that Georgia has made to US and NATO operations in various parts of the world, in particular to Iraq and Afghanistan, and the ultimate sacrifice that almost 36 Georgians have made in contributing to those efforts. So Georgia has demonstrated a willingness to be a contributor to international security and stability, not just within its own nearby region. And Georgia has expressed interest in joining Euro-Atlantic institutions. While the United States is not a member of the European Union, we are, of course, a member of NATO. And in 2008, in the Bucharest NATO summit, NATO pledged that Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO. And the exact language was, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. And here we are now 13 years later, and I don't think there's been sufficient progress made toward achieving that goal. It is in US interest to see Georgia be part of the piece of the puzzle of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And Georgia is a key piece of that puzzle. And so we want to see that puzzle completed. Now, last thing I would say, particularly you talked about the broader regional issues underway. There's obviously deep concern about what Mr. Putin might be up to with Ukraine. And there have been discussions, including at NATO yesterday, led by Secretary of State Tony Blinken, to focus on pushing back on this. And this came up in a phone call yesterday between President Biden and President Putin. And I worry that the focus on Ukraine may shift what was already rather little attention from the West on the situation in Georgia. And we have to be able to do both. We have to be able to focus on the threats that Russia continues to pose to Ukraine, while also trying to help Georgia stay on the right path for democracy and toward Euro-Atlantic integration.
Thank you, David, very much for your support and for a very clear vision and position on those very challenging aspects where Georgia finds itself at this point now. And you mentioned this telephone conversation between Biden and Putin. So let me ask you a quick follow-up question right here. So there was a mention of possible summit between the presidents that might take place anytime soon. And based on the context of that conversation, we can imagine that Ukraine will be extensively discussed in the event of such a summit. But do you think Georgia will be included in the agenda? If no, why not? And if yes, in what context then you expect President Biden and Putin discussing Georgia in the event of their meeting?
Well, I will, let me first start by saying I was surprised at the mention of a summit between the two, given several things. One, the growing Russian threat to Ukraine, the buildup of military forces along the border with Ukraine, as well as in Crimea, which we still think is part of Ukrainian territory. The treatment of Navalny, I was disappointed in the White House statement that Navalny was not mentioned. And I was quite surprised at the reference to a possible summit between the two leaders, given what's happening. There are expectations that this week there will be another round of sanctions announced by the United States for Russian interference in the 2020 election and also for the SolarWinds attack. And so based on that, it seems to me, I'm not quite sure what the two leaders would frankly sit down and discuss. President Putin's already been invited to the climate change summit. It will be virtual, that the White House will host later this month. And if the two leaders get together, and I really underscore the word if, because if the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, if Navalny tragically is killed in prison, I can't see the two leaders getting together. But if the two leaders get together, I certainly hope that Georgia would be on the agenda. I hope it would be on the agenda in a positive way, and to some extent that will be up to Georgians to determine in what way Georgia would come up. Obviously, Russia continues to occupy 20% of Georgian territory, so that's not positive. But the message should be crystal clear to Moscow: stay out of Georgian affairs, let the Georgians sort this out. But there are many Georgians who seek Western help and support for this, and I think the West has an obligation to respond to that interest.
Thank you, David. Now I wanted to include Ambassador Kelly into the conversation and ask a question about this Georgia being on the verge. You know, to me and to many friends of mine who have been fighting for Georgia's pro-Western and pro-democracy cause for years and even decades. Now, it is clear that Russia has moved to a new stage of its strategy with regard to Georgia and is now pushing for the formal switch of Georgia's foreign policy. So if before Russia was happy with the Georgian government being ambivalent on the Western integration front and not taking decisive steps towards the progress, but still, you know, saying that, okay, we want to join NATO, we want to join European Union, we even might apply for the membership in the European Union in 2024. This was just on the level of narrative still there that we are pro-Western and we're still aspiring to join European and Euro-Atlantic structures. But now, after particularly Gavrilov's visit, which I think was the test of how far Russians can push Georgian society in the first place, you know, to formally switch its foreign policy orientation, and especially after Anaklia port project was effectively killed and destroyed, which would have strengthened Western interests in the region and which would have limited Russian influence in the region, right? This kind of specific things define what kind of actor you are. It's not about narrative. It's not about saying that you want to join NATO. It's about what you do on the ground, right? That determines what kind of a strategy you have. So how does it look from your perspective? Do you think that Russians really want Georgia to formally abandon its Western orientation and become a part of Russia's orbit? Is that the right time for Russians to push for that?
Thanks, Shota, and let me join David in thanking Nino and the EPRC and you, Shota, for everything you've done to support our report and help us get the word out about the case for supporting Georgia. In terms of what Russia's goals are, not only for Georgia but for the post-Soviet space, you know, including Ukraine, I think their goals are simply to ensure that Georgia does not actually enter into a membership action plan and doesn't become a member of NATO, also doesn't become a member of the EU. I also was concerned about the decision of the Georgian government last year or the year before to stop the Anaklia project. I think if you look at who gains from that decision not to build a deep water port on the Black Sea, it's Russia. I was concerned that this port, which would have increased, I think, the ability of NATO to cooperate with the Georgian Coast Guard, to have more ship visits, to really provide a Western anchor for a southern corridor for Caspian energy. It really, I think, was mostly to the advantage of Russia. To answer your question directly, I think the Russians are realistic, and I don't think that they really count on Georgia at any time in the foreseeable future joining the Eurasian Union or the CSTO. I think basically they have the same kind of tactics that they use in Ukraine, and that's simply to ensure that these aspirant countries are not attractive for NATO and EU membership. That's why both countries are under occupation with their borders, international borders in question. But I really think that their goal, their realistic goal, is neutrality, and they have a lot of different means to try and push that narrative that Georgia is better off not a member of NATO, not a member of the EU, for reasons of traditions and values on one hand, but of course on the other, the narrative they push out that if Ukraine and Georgia join NATO or join the EU, there will be war, and it's an obtuse but effective narrative that they push out.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. And of course, if anybody watches closely Russian narratives here in Georgia, that's indeed one of the most harmful narratives that they have. That if you guys behave, if you do not go to NATO, to EU, then we can actually make things easier for you. So this is one of the strategic narratives that Russia is really pushing forward. But I read a very interesting thing in the report, which I wanted to ask you about. And this is partly the follow-up to the previous question I had. And I quote from the report: Georgia should not look to China as an alternative to Russia. So we here in Georgia are so focused on Russian threat, and we're so actually consumed by the overwhelming pressure that is coming from the Russian Federation that we might be missing, some other big events happening around our borders and interests. So do you see really China on the equal level being engaged in Georgia as Russia, or what does that statement is actually supposed to say?
I'll take a first shot if you want, Ian, and if you want to jump in. Let me first state that the United States has provided more than $4 billion in military and non-military assistance to Georgia. So by no means has the United States not been present in Georgia. We continue, I think, to be the most influential country there. But there was a period after Ian left as ambassador where we did not have an ambassador there. Now, fortunately, Kelly Degnan is the U.S. ambassador now. That didn't help the U.S. standing. The reason we mention China is there tends to be bipartisan support in the United States to take a tougher line toward China. And countries that look to say Georgia is cozying up to China may be unfair, but to look to China as an alternative to Russia, I don't think will sit very well in Washington. China obviously doesn't pose a military threat to Georgia, but China has a way of making countries indebted to it by providing financial assistance and loans and other things. China looks to fill voids that other countries leave. And this means that the West, the EU, perhaps in particular, as well as the United States, need to step up and provide more support for Georgia so that China is not viewed as the alternative, since Russia is not really an option. And so China is a brutal authoritarian regime. Look at what they've done in Hong Kong. Look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs, to the Tibetans, the threats that they pose to Taiwan. China is not let me be clear. The Communist Party of China is not a friend of Georgia. China is, the people may be friends of Georgia, but the leadership in China is not. So given that it is an authoritarian regime, given that it looks to use economic and financial assistance to hook countries and make them indebted to China, and given that they don't care about human rights, they don't care about democracy, they just want greater control, and they want to be able to flex their economic as well as military muscles. I think looking to China as an option would be a mistake on the part of Georgia.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead, Shota.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I just wanted to say I totally agree with David. I think that David really, I think, in a very succinct way, summarized what the concerns of Washington would be for a closer relationship with China. I would just like to add that one of my concerns is just the rise of illiberal, aggressive powers closer to home, right on the border with Georgia, and the marginalization of the West. And Shota, you talked about the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and and the outcome was the stationing of Russian troops now in the third of the three South Caucasus countries. But it was, one of the outcomes was the shift of the negotiating mechanism and of the multilateral mechanism for resolving the conflict from two Western powers, the U.S. and France, to two illiberal, power-driven states, Russia and Turkey. And this platform that has been suggested, that would be overseen by these two larger powers, completely marginalizes the Western countries. And I am, I think, more concerned about this kind of creeping hegemony, a word I have a hard time pronouncing, in the South Caucasus. And I really hope that the Biden administration, once it gets its team in place, is going to jump back in both feet, not only with in Georgia, but in trying to come to a just solution of the conflicts in Georgia and in Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much. And since I'm occupying Nino's seat here and Nino's beautiful background, let me turn to her finally with the question. And I want you, Nino, to help me to zoom into more Georgia-related issues and the ongoing internal political developments and let's say crisis right away, because we are in a very severe political crisis. Unfortunately, not all the political actors acknowledge that fully, but we are here, to make a sober analysis of what is going on. So let me just briefly say a couple of words about how concerned I am about the humiliation of the EU-led dialogue between the political actors in Georgia. And I think that the hard-headed position, and I will not shy away from saying this, the obstruction of that dialogue by the ruling party is of a great concern in the context of what we just said, of Georgia being at the verge of making this, final drift towards the Western choice of its people, or falling to the blackmail from the Russian Federation. And what we have seen is that after this humiliation, the second day there was a visit by the well-known Kremlin propagandist, Mr. Posner, who was met by the escorts and was, escorted through the police convoys in the city, being allowed to, break the rules of quarantining and whatnot. So in this context, and in the context also what we said about Georgia's real progress and steps towards NATO and EU integration, which is limited to the bureaucratic exchanges and statements, in my understanding. What, if anything, still makes Georgia a pro-Western and democratic player today? And how do we deserve such a great help and support from the friends of Georgia, like we have two of them here, from David and from Yin, and many others who are coming and fighting for Georgia's pro-Western future? Why Georgia is still a pro-Western player, and how do you think we should continue this fight along the choice of the people?
Thank you so much, Shota, for these questions. But first of all, I would like to sincerely thank David Cramer and Ambassador Ian Kelly for doing this fantastic book, I can call it, on the political dynamics around Georgia since the regaining of our independence in early 19th of the last century. And we have some jokes that we're calling them the best historians of the Georgian 21st century history. And thank you so much for doing this. And thanks a lot for choosing EPRC as a partner to working on this. To come back to your question, Shota, while most of us were considering that the 2012 peaceful change of power was an opportunity to step up in democratic credentials, reinforce achievements, and correcting the shortfalls, it happened, unfortunately, in opposite order. Consolidation of power under Georgian Dream government, attacking free media, independent businesses, political opponents, NGOs, and all this process lubricated by the increased corruption is a very sad story of the Georgia's, Euro-Atlantic past, unfortunately. In parallel, government was maintaining the facade of democracy and the Western aspirations, but gradually downgrading its pro-Western democracy agenda, thus diminishing the leverages of West or US usually had in Georgia. As you are aware, developments is not very encouraging because yesterday the opposition leader Milia's pretrial detention directly indicates that the Georgian government is not aware of its core responsibility to bring the country out of the current crisis. The government can take steps towards de-escalation, but it's not taking actions on purpose. This in turn prolongs the crisis and destabilization, which is literally destroying the country and in the long run, taking us away from NATO and European Union. We can say, and what might be the hope that the assumption that all parties is seeking EU-NATO membership has not been proved by the actual deeds behind this rhetorical facade of the Georgian Dream government. In this, they have been consistent since 2012, and true is this assumption is absolutely majority of the Georgian people wants to be a part of the European and NATO family, but Ivanishvili's foreign policy vision is quite different. And I think this was proved also with the resignation of the ambassador of Georgia to European Union, that she was saying that, just only having this declaration or like a facade of declarative statements that we are going to the way to join the European Union or NATO. We should act as Europeans, but we're facing right now today the political crisis in Georgia, which is radically reversing the democratic development of the country. and heavily undermines our European and Euro-Atlantic perspective. A prolongation of this crisis in Georgia, as David and Ian mentioned in their report, only benefits the Kremlin at a time when the country is facing like a serious geopolitical threats, while resolving the crisis and ensuring the country's democratic development are important factors for Georgia's quick accession in Euro-Atlantic family. And increasingly described as and many of our colleagues from the non-governmental like organizations like Transparency International and some prominent organizations, they're talking about and describing this as a state capture in clearly evident when one looks at the Georgian judiciary, politicized prosecution of opposition, never-ending attempts of the ruling party to suppress the critical media and the civil society organizations. And reasonably, as a consequences of the current reality, we witnessed that daily aggravating economic situation on the ground, withdrawal of the FDI, and reluctance to deal with Georgia. And the pandemic situation, you know, and the next third wave of COVID-19 pandemic, the government is going to seriously considering tightening of already heavy restrictions in this country. And unfortunately, you know, by the by 2020, just to look to the economic indicators of the country's gross domestic product, GDP per capita in US dollars terms, stood at approximately the same level as it was in beginning of 2013, which implied that this 6 economically lost years, you know. And just let me stop here, and maybe we will come back to for your next question if it comes to. I don't want to take too long from your.
No, Nino,
time.
great. Thank you very much. We really do need that loud and clear and sober voice from within the center of the fight for democracy in Georgia, you know, and BPRC has always been in the center of that fight, and you personally. So it is extremely important to give a very realistic stance on what is really going on here in Georgia, because in some instances, unfortunately, this real message is lost in diplomatic statements and in the diplomatic, you know, communication between the governments on governmental level, and that's the indispensable role of civil society to underline that actually the processes that are unfolding in Georgia right now are beyond that copy-paste, you know, diplomatic statements in many cases. And another quote from the report that I wanted to read out here is that the state capture is a growing problem that will stunt foreign investment if not arrested quickly. So the state capture is a very specific term, you know, which encompasses a lot of things that you have mentioned already during your intervention. But let me ask you this. Now, how come that after what really happened in last year's Georgian elections, after what happened in the talks mediated by the EU, after jailing of the leader of the largest opposition party, we're still discussing these 5 points which were left here in Tbilisi by President Michel. And one of them are related to the elections. The second one is related to political prisoners, Melia and Rurua. And the others are related to the reform process and strengthening democracy and the processes why this actual government has been hired by the Georgian people and is paid by the Georgian people to do all those, electoral reforms and judiciary reforms. But still, somehow we see that in many diplomatic statements, the assessment of the elections are ambiguous, to say the least, which leave a lot of ground for the ruling party to speculate that, okay, there was no problem with the elections, it was recognized by everybody, it was a legitimate election, so we're not talking about that at all. And this is coming from that not very clear assessment from some reports that we have seen. The same goes for the judiciary reform. The only argument that the government is actually promoting now against releasing the political prisoners is that we do have a free judiciary system in this country, and it's not up to the government or the prime minister to decide who will go to jail and who will come out, and that is also very well facilitated by those diplomatic statements, which praise various waves of judiciary reforms. But in the reality, we see what we see here in the report, the statement about the state capture. So how do you see this, balance should go between the diplomatic and, let's say, friendly exchange on the governmental level, and infusing the real state of affairs into that communication between the friends and the real pro-democracy stakeholders there?
Well, David, if you don't mind, I'll take the first crack at this one. Shota, you're absolutely right. I think that state capture is a real and present danger to Georgian democracy. I'm not going to say much about it, but because I think everybody knows that the essential problem is that you have a power unaccountable to the voters, unelected by the voters, making many of the critical decisions behind the scenes. And many of these decisions, of course, are economic decisions that seem designed to support certain individuals close to this unaccountable power. But the other problem I see is equally acute, and that's the problem of accumulation of power, the steady move to one-party rule. This is the issue, I think, which is the most immediate and needs to be resolved in very quick fashion. This is not a problem, as we point out in the report, which is unique to the Georgian Dream government right now. This is a tendency that can be seen really throughout modern Georgian history, since the restoration of independence. This tendency to remove checks and balances, to not give enough power to Parliament for an oversight role, to make sure that government is being held accountable, and most acutely, the reluctance or even refusal to take the kind of steps to ensure that the judiciary can carry out its critical role of oversight and providing a check on the government. We don't have that, and we see over the last 8 years a steady erosion of other checks and balances that you see in democratic countries, and that you saw more often in Georgia than you did in most other post-Soviet spaces. And that would be a free and unfettered media scene. We don't see that now. We see a lot of intimidation in those voices that are critical of the government. And you see the intimidation of civil society as well, which David and I find particularly alarming. But absent the idea of an independent judiciary, I do not see how Georgia can truly become a balanced democratic state. if you look at our own country, and God knows we have our own problems and our own slips toward illiberality and even authoritarianism, but if you compare our two elections, we were able to emerge out of this situation where the executive was trying to steal an election and was prevented from doing so by independent courts. And this is what was missing, I think, in the fall last year in Georgia. The idea of a trusted, independent adjudicator of claims of fraud and interference by the government in the elections. So this is it's not an issue that's going to be resolved anytime soon, obviously, but it is an issue that all Georgians need to demand from their government to have these kinds of reforms that would ensure an independent judiciary.
Thank you very much. David, would you like to comment on this before we move to the audience?
Sure. Let me just, I agree with everything Ian said. Let me just get a little more specific on a few things. One is after the controversial elections in the fall, Georgia was at an impasse. There was a stalemate between the opposition and the governing party, Georgian Dream. I think Georgian Dream and the government then turned a stalemate into a crisis after Mr. Ivanishvili essentially, it seems, demanded the arrest of Nika Melia. Now, the former Prime Minister Gaharia refused to carry out this order and resigned. Mr. Gaharia is someone I had criticized back in 2019 when he was Minister of Interior, given the response to the protests after the appearance by Gavrilov in the Georgian parliament. But I commended Gaharia for taking what I think was, at least it seemed to be, a principled position and refusing to carry out the arrest of Melia. But Mr. Ivanishvili had a solution for that. Gaharia left, stepped down, and in his place came Mr. Garibashvili. And he came in seeming rather enthusiastic to carry out Ivanishvili's orders to arrest Melia. And within days, Melia, first the authorities raided the headquarters of UNM, and then they arrested Mr. Melia. I don't represent United National Movement. I don't represent any parties in Georgia. I'm not even sure I've ever met Mr. Melia, but I think his arrest turned, as I said, the stalemate into a crisis, because I don't know how you can resolve the crisis between the opposition and Georgian Dream as long as the leader of the main opposition party is sitting in jail. So it seems to me that Georgian Dream and the authorities need to take the first step, and that is to release Mr. Melia. Mr. Ruhr should also be released, because that should have been done based on the agreement reached a little over a year ago, and he was never released as part of that deal. But Mr. Melia represents the main opposition party. He needs to have a seat at the table. Frankly, I think tactically it's a mistake on the part of Georgian Dream, because if they were to release Mr. Melia, then the pressure could be evenly applied on all parties to find some compromise, that the opposition should then take its seats as long as Georgian Dream agrees to give them positions that matter in the parliament. And I think in the absence of releasing Mr. Melia, pressure from the West should grow, and it should grow on the government. I saw a question posted from Facebook viewer about the possibility of sanctions. I have called for sanctions on Mr. Ivanishvili and the Prime Minister if Mr. Melia is not released. I don't know how likely that is, but I would just say this, that I don't think Mr. Kolomoisky or Mr. Plahotniuk in Ukraine and Moldova, respectively, anticipated that they would be sanctioned by the United States, but they have been. So I would be careful if I were sitting in Tbilisi, thinking that this will never happen to me. It's possible. And I think as the Congress comes back, it's now back in session in Washington, there may be more attention focused on this. There already was a hearing in the Senate subcommittee on Georgia, and I think there will be more attention focused. And I think members of Congress will wonder, why has this crisis not been resolved yet? The Georgians are shooting themselves in the foot with this. It's a self-inflicted wound, and Georgians need to sort it out. But if necessary, I do think some pressure from the West could be helpful.
David, thank you so much. You're the best panelist I ever had, not because you have that very clear-cut positions, but I don't even have to ask questions from the audience to you. You do it by yourself. Thank you very much. There has been a hand raised by Nino Gelashvili for quite long now. So let us hear her question. Please briefly identify yourself and make your question as concise as possible, please, to enable also other participants to engage.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Nino Gelashvili. I work for the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Georgian service. You can only hear me, right? Or you can see me also?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Can't see you.
Okay. So you mentioned about the possibility of sanctions and pressure, which is, of course, very important. But do you think, don't you think the US can be involved in solving Georgia's political crisis as a mediator? I mean, after two very intensive but still unsuccessful attempts of the European Council's President, Personal Representative Danielson. And are you familiar with the letter of Georgian NGOs they sent to the US senators with this same request? And my second question will be, is keeping the doors open, doors of the NATO and the EU for Georgia, is it still enough, you think? You mention it in the report, which I'm very thankful for. And don't you think this is a time for taking into consideration Ukrainian situation around Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, that there is a time for an extraordinary decision by NATO to grant Ukraine and Georgia membership action plans while pressing more these two countries on implementing their essential reforms? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who wants to go first? You guys or?
David, please. I think
Okay.
Question was addressed to you mainly.
Okay, I'll start, and then Ian and Nino can jump in. First, Nino, thank you for your very good questions. Let me start with the last one first, and I'm going to disappoint you. No, I don't think NATO is going to respond to the Russia-Ukraine crisis by moving faster on membership. I recognize that President Zelensky has been raising this issue much more forcefully. I do think there's a role for NATO to play here, including by sending more ships into the Black Sea region, and that is happening. The United States is doing that as well. But I don't think the Russia-Ukraine crisis will lead to invitations to either country in the near future to join. Joining is a lengthy process, and I know for Georgians it has been too long. But I don't think you will see a quick solution to that issue. On U.S. mediation, I think if the United States went ahead with some sanctions or talked about sanctions on the two individuals I mentioned, I do think that the crisis won't be solved overnight, but will move in the right direction. I know there's been some talk about conditioning U.S. assistance to Georgia based on resolution of this crisis. I appreciate the spirit of that. I'm not sure that will have the desired impact. I'm not sure Mr. Ivanishvili will care, frankly. But he obviously would care if he were the target of sanctions. And so I think if we want to get his attention, the way to do so is through targeted measures. Conditioning assistance would also hurt the people of Georgia, the country. And I don't think any of us is interested in doing that. What we want to do is apply some pressure points to get this crisis resolved. And when it comes to mediation role, look, I salute what Ambassador Degnan has been doing, what her EU colleagues have been doing. I think once that critical point of getting Amelia released is crossed, this, I think, does need to be a Georgian solution with some outside assistance. But I don't know that the United States should be involved in the decision whether to rerun the election. I'm not sure if there were a rerun of the election, it would produce a different result, radically so, absent electoral reform. To me, the issue was not whether Georgian Dream got more votes than any other party. The issue was whether they got enough votes to form a government without having to form a coalition. That, I think, is the tricky thing. And I'm not sure a rerun of the election would produce a different result. There were problems with the election. There's no question about it. EPRC and Transparency International, local organizations have documented these. The International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and ODIHR have also documented these. Georgian Dream obviously just focuses on the positive things that are said and overlooks the criticisms and the concerns that were expressed. But I don't know whether it's for the United States to weigh in on whether Georgia needs a new election. I would hope that once Amelia is released, sits at the table, the opposition takes its seats, that they can sort out the best way forward. Sorry for going on so long.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a few things on the issue of the opportunity for Georgia that the situation, the very tense situation in Ukraine represents. I thought it was interesting that this morning a Republican senator, Rob Portman, put out a tweet saying now is the time for NATO to provide a clear path for Ukraine to membership. So I think this situation does present an opportunity for Georgia. I agree with David that NATO membership, because of the rule of consensus, is not something which is in the near or even medium term. But I think it's a good time for Georgia to be positioned to benefit from a closer relationship with the United States military. I think, absent the kind of thing that Rob Portman is calling for, the fallback position would be increased U.S. involvement in terms of training, pre-positioning of defensive deterrent weapon systems. And Georgia, of course, is in the same position as Ukraine in the sense that it's under occupation. So again, this is another situation where Georgia really has to get its house in order, where both the government and the opposition has to realize that they are missing some important opportunities at the beginning of a new American administration that's very pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic relations, and they are mired in this stalemate right now. And speaking of that stalemate, the issue of U.S. mediation, it's difficult for me to see how the United States would agree to get involved in a very divisive political situation when the EU was unable to move the needle at all. I think if the U.S. gets involved, it has to be with the understanding that that there has to be a clear agreement for some kind of power sharing that would enable the seating of a multi-party parliament. Right now, if I were in the State Department, I'd be looking at this and saying, why should we go down the same path as the EU, and, to mix my metaphors, crash and burn at the end as the EU did? So there has to be a clear understanding, a clear statement from the government that they are open to power sharing, because that's the solution here. As David said, it's not new elections. it's signaling that they are willing to share power, that all of these tendencies that we've seen with the, the lack of judicial reform, the intimidation of media and civil society, that they're willing to, to turn the corner and really develop checks and balances. But absent that kind of signal from the government, I would not recommend the State Department take this on.
Can I just inject one other element here that I think you viewers need to realize? I know we're in the middle of in the middle of April now, sorry. And so it's almost 3 months that the Biden administration has been in office, but they do not have their full team in place yet. I believe there are only 3 officials who have been confirmed by the Senate in their positions, maybe 4 if you count the UN ambassador. But there's no assistant secretary for European and Eurasian affairs. George Kent, who does a terrific job, the deputy assistant secretary, also has responsibility for Ukraine and Belarus and Armenia and Azerbaijan. And so George is not in a position to play the role of mediator. Ian and I, not in the report, but offline, have discussed maybe there should be a kind of visit by some senior members of Congress to show interest. And that's possible, but traveling during a pandemic makes it almost impossible. Hopefully the pandemic is reaching its final stages. And if it does so, then perhaps you could see some visits by members of Congress. I certainly don't want to speak for them. I can't promise anything for them. But I do sense that there is interest and concern in Congress, and some people might be willing to offer their services as a kind of special envoy or a congressional delegation that would visit, and maybe they could help provide some impetus, but they're also not going to be able to provide a sustained mediation effort. And so I think expectations need to be reined in a little bit.
Thank you, David. And before we move on with the questions, Nino, let me ask you to pick up one of these questions from the attendees. And David have already talked about Gaharia's role in some different episodes of recent Georgian history, and not all of them were that admirable, of course. And now we really need more time to understand whether he is developing himself into an independent player. If yes, then what kind of player is he going to be? Will he be able to detach himself from the Georgian dream and his legacy of working with Ivanishvili or not? I mean, these are the speculations. I don't expect you, Nino, to have a clear answer on that. But what I wanted to ask you related to Gaharia is this. So we're talking about this legitimation of the elections, right? And whether or not the new elections should be done. So Gaharia here also plays an important role because he was #1 on the party list that won the elections. I mean, that according to the announced outcomes. And even the #1 who was more #1 than himself, and he who was the #1 actually on the paper, they both left. So it turns out that 2 people that gained the votes for the ruling party are now not involved in Georgian Dream's policies. And there are people in charge who have not even participated mostly in the pre-election campaign, and nobody actually expected to vote for them. So what do you think? I mean, is that an additional argument for requesting the snap elections on top of the irregularities and a lot of misconduct of the elections itself?
Thank you so much, Shota, for this question. I still think that, before the opposition party and government come up with some solutions or the compromise to work together on the different judiciary, electoral system reform and some, because if we're not going to change the system, the next election with the same like a judiciary system and with the same electoral like a commission is going to be again the some like a yard for fighting. And in my understanding, when Bidzina Ivanishvili, like a third time we're leaving the politics, he promised us that he will create some opposition within the parliament, and show to the rest of the world or European Union that what kind of opposition even he can create, and it's very anecdotal in this like a situation. And of course, today also the 6th member of the Georgian Dream party, they left and they joined the Mr. Gaharia's party. We don't know yet, but I still think that former Prime Minister, Mr. Gaharia, is responsible for what happened in Gavrilov's night and what happened to arresting, the Georgi Rurua, one of the co-founder of the Mtavariarchy. And, before these people are before the situation is we have and we're facing right now, it looks like a hostage bargaining, and until these people, the Rurua, Mr. Rurua and Mr. Melia is not released, I don't think that there is any the ground to continue these negotiations or this a consensus, because yesterday, as we saw, the UNM party told that they are just stopping all negotiations because yesterday also they left the Mr. Melia in prison, and it does not underlines again the government's willingness to de-escalate the political crisis and then to start to negotiate on the reform agenda or sharing power or whatever. Until these people are in prison, I don't think there is any a sign of continuing these negotiations, unfortunately. I think the Batu is raising the hand, or maybe we can give some people to ask the questions as well.
Yeah, I see a lot of distinguished people in the audience who are also contributors of EPRC's publications frequently, and I will put those people on spot unless they come forward with their remarks. But before that, Batu, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Shota, for moderating great discussion and the EPRC organizing this. Great to see you, David and Jan. Always enjoying hearing your opinion on the problematic issues and quite challenging circumstances we have here in Georgia. And while we've been discussing the problems of the Georgian political impasse and the state capture, Georgia is not a unique country, and this similar type of state captures either happened or was attempted in other countries as well. And Russia has been a player in this through its financial or other corrupt means, etc. So what we have in Georgia right now is that still Georgia is the most pro-American country. Georgian public views and recent IRI polls showed is that US is our major ally politically, economically, security-wise. But in that circumstances, we have a government that is much more susceptible on the Russian pressure or Russian leverages than the American ones. So how it happened, and it did not happen overnight. And just to rephrase the Winston Churchill's famous quote about the Americans always to be counted to do the right thing after they tried everything else. So have you tried everything else already?
No, we haven't tried everything else already, definitely. On that issue of this slide towards Russia by the Georgian Dream government, I think, a lot of that is anecdotal, of course, but there is a bunch of empirical evidence of it, obviously, the visits that were mentioned, Gavrilov and Posner, and then the Anaklia. I think it's really it's a reflection of 4 years of benign neglect under the Trump administration. I think that there were people either consciously or subconsciously calculating that they weren't going to come under pressure from the previous administration. As David said, unfortunately, there was a long gap without an ambassador. I very much regret that, and I'm glad that Kelly's in place now. But it's important, I think, that you now have a very different administration, and it's still early days, because of our very complicated, drawn out confirmation process. As David said, we really only have 3 or 4 confirmed members of Biden's team in the State Department. But I think as that team gets in place, particularly an undersecretary for political affairs, our good friend Victoria Nuland, and then an assistant secretary for European affairs, I think that you'll see, much more involvement in helping Georgia resist the malign influence that it exerts on Georgian society. And I also think that you're going to see some conditionality too for aid. If it doesn't come from the administration, as David said, it'll come from Congress. And there are wheels turning now. And as David said, we're both concerned. We don't want to see the Georgian people affected by conditionality of aid. But I do think that you're going to see a system of carrots and sticks that really didn't exist under the Trump administration with the Biden administration.
Thank you. Jane. Any comments from David and Nino on this, or we can move forward with the other questions?
Go ahead, Nino. I think Ian said it well. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, very good.
Nino is trying to speak. Sorry, Nino is trying to speak.
Your mic is muted, Nino.
I still believe that if it's not the interference from the European and especially the United States, we don't have any hope that this political crisis is going to end very soon, and of course it's we can recall the 2 parties to come up to sit down and to have this the compromise, but without saying that the main responsibility, of course, lies with the ruling party, and they are responsible, to bring the opposition to the table and to to de-escalate the situation. I think that if the current reality does not immediately change, we will face a very grave consequences in the medium and long-term perspective, which is in turn will put Georgia much further from its ambition to join the European Union and Euro-Atlantic organization. And I still believe that now it's a unique chance to Georgia and also for Ukraine as well, somehow if we use this chance and to build on and to implement this reform agenda, what we have several times supported from our strategic partners from United States and European Union, it's gonna be the very good time somehow to go forward Georgia and Ukraine to joining NATO and the European Union. But the situation is really hopeless in my understanding if our strategic partners, especially from United States, is not gonna taking their leadership role as always, that taking these negotiations or mediation in a different level.
Thank you, Nino. And as we're moving towards the end of the session, let me ask all the panelists to focus a little bit more on solutions. We have identified lots of problems, more than enough, really. It's enough for, I think, 5 countries at least. But all of them are faced by Georgia, little tiny Georgia. And in the region, there are also a lot of challenges which add to our internal problems and multiple layers of crisis that we have. So what could and should we all do about it? And then there is this brilliant section in the report about the way ahead and the recommendations of what can really be done there. And I can absolutely only agree to everything that is written in that final part of the report, especially. But I would say, without a coherent and coordinated long-term strategy on the future of this region and this part of the world, none of these elements alone can deliver and can change the status quo on the ground. Because every time we are in this reactive mode, right? Russia does something, we're trying to react to this, we're trying to reverse some things that are suggested by Russia as the realities, and it is always more costly than to have a proactive line of efforts and the actions that would lead us towards our goals. But we have hardly seen that sort of strategic approach from the United States or from the EU or transatlantic strategy, which would be the best and the most helpful thing in this in this reality that we face. And I honestly think that without that kind of coherent strategy, Russia will continue to treat this region and treat Georgia and Ukraine as the sphere of its exclusive influence. And no matter how hard we will try within Georgia, within Ukraine, or such great friends of both countries as David and Yin and many, many others, it will be very difficult to change status quo and to change the difficult realities that we already find ourselves in. So how would you see that strategy evolving given all the hopes that we have for the incoming administration and rest of the pieces of the puzzle that were discussed during this panel today? So I would ask all the panelists to reflect to that. And please, David, if I may ask you to start.
Sure, Shota, thanks. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just run through very quickly the 7 recommendations that we have in the report. The first is to show more interest and more engagement in Georgia. I do think that the United States, as the country with the greatest influence in Georgia, needs to exercise that influence more than it has. And that would include reinvigorating the U.S.-Georgian Strategic Partnership Commission. Second, make sure that do what we can to encourage Georgia to stay on democratic, Western-oriented paths so that it can continue to pursue its integration with the Euro-Atlantic community, which leads to the third, that is the Euro-Atlantic community needs to keep the doors open to both EU and NATO, given what we pledged in 2008 when it comes to NATO, but the EU too has a very important role to play here. Help Georgia build better checks and balances with strong democratic institutions, and make sure that civil society continues to play a vital role, as should independent media in Georgia. Ian and I have put this, the 5th recommendation in. We realize it may be a difficult one to achieve, but we would support fast tracking a free trade agreement to the extent possible, recognizing that there are other countries trying to sign one with the United States, but we think this actually could be very beneficial. 6, help Georgia defend itself. And this means that there is an ongoing threat from Russia. Ukrainians are reminded of this every day. You don't need to hear me sitting in the United States remind you of the threat Russia poses, which also leads to the seventh recommendation, help push back on Russian threats to Georgia and to the broader region for that matter, because in the absence of doing so, we risk ceding the field to Russia, and that wouldn't be good for anyone. The last thing I would just say before at least I go is we also felt it was very important to start the report with an author's note. And in that note, we acknowledge the problems and challenges we face here in the United States. This has not been the finest time for the United States over the past recent past. And so we approach the criticisms we offer in the report with perhaps an even stronger dose of humility than we might have in the past, though we should always approach these things with a dose of humility. We're not perfect, but as you said, Shota, rightly so, Ian and I, as the two outsiders here, are very strong supporters and friends of Georgia. We want to see the country succeed. That will be good for the United States, and most importantly, it will be good for Georgians.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Shota, and thanks, David. I think that's a good way to wrap up this webinar by giving a good synopsis of our recommendations. You know what I would add is that, and this is a sense that I had when I was ambassador 3 years ago, but that our policy is really hitched too much to security. I mean, security is really important. Helping Georgia become independent, resist aggression, but our strategy needs to be much more comprehensive. We need to look at ways not only to deter aggression, but to make Georgia into a more resilient state. And there needs to be an economic component of our strategy. And I think that'll be the way for Georgia really to become a strong, prosperous state and a virtuous countermodel to the kind of vertically driven authoritarian regimes that we see all around it. And a big part of that, I think, is related to the issue of the independent judiciary. That is the biggest obstacle to foreign direct investment, is the lack of a real guarantee of investments because of the political use of the judiciary. So this comprehensive approach would have to include, not just security initiatives, but also some joint projects to help develop the Georgian economy and help to develop an independent, kind of an arbitrage type system that could attract more foreign direct investment.
Shota, I couldn't say better than Ian and David mentioned in the report, all cascades of their recommendation, which is all of them very important. Just I want to underline, and it's mentioned also into the report, that being for Georgia a democratic country is a part of our national security issues. And for us, having these democratic institutions, civil society, free media, and strengthening this democratic institutions on the other side as well, it's very important. And I would like to ask from our strategic partners to have more involvement and more support for the civil society organization and the free media in this country, because where we stand right now and why Georgia and still pluralistic or democratic country as we are, somehow it's because we have such a strong civil society organizations and free media in this country, despite the fact they have a lot of barriers and a lot of fights for freedom and democracy of this country. And let me thank you for your participation and for this report, and also being such a greatest friends of Georgia for so many decades. Thank you so much from my side.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Very good. So it appears to be a self-summarizing panel, so there is no need to summarize the moderator. I, from my side, once again, thank GMF and DPRC for allowing this very fruitful discussion, and for once again, David and Ian, thank you for putting this very, very timely and helpful report together. It is sort of a compass and a guideline through the challenges that Georgia and the region is facing today. So if there is anybody who wants to help Georgia in solving those problems, here is this, big part of the strategic approach already delivered on the paper. They will just need to turn it into the action plan. So, what is the difference between a good idea and the strategy is the resources. So now we need to resource all the good ideas and turn it into an actionable strategy. And I hope that that will be coming very, very soon. With this, I would thank all the participants of the panel and the audience for their active participation. And that's it for today. Thank you.